I showed up at my sister's birthday after 11 years. Nobody recognized me, not even my own mother. Her husband looked me in the eye and asked who I was. I just smiled and said, "If you truly knew, you'd see people begging for forgiveness soon." I, 29M, stood outside the familiar suburban house, watching through the large bay window as my family celebrated inside. 11 years had passed since I'd last seen any of them, and the transformation was complete. The scrawny 18-year-old they'd thrown out had become someone entirely different. My sister was blowing out candles on what looked like an expensive cake, surrounded by faces I recognized, but who would never recognize me. The weight I'd gained, the beard, the expensive suit, the confidence in my posture, everything about me had changed. But most importantly, my name had changed too. Legally, officially, and in every way that mattered. I adjusted my tie and walked up the front steps. The doorbell's chime was the same melody I remembered from childhood, back when this place had been home instead of a prison. My brother-in-law answered the door. He was exactly as I remembered, tall, arrogant, with that practiced smile he used on everyone he considered beneath him. His eyes scanned me with polite confusion, clearly trying to place where he might know me from. He asked who I was, and I just smiled, letting the moment stretch. The anticipation felt delicious. I told him that if he truly knew, he'd see people begging for forgiveness soon. His confusion deepened, but he stepped aside anyway, probably assuming I was some business associate or friend of a friend. I walked into the living room where the party was in full swing. My mother was there, looking older but still maintaining that rigid posture she'd always carried. She glanced at me with mild curiosity before returning to her conversation. My sister, the birthday girl, was laughing with a group of her friends, completely oblivious to my presence. But I wasn't here for a reunion. I was here because today marked exactly 11 years since they destroyed my life, and I'd spent every single day of those 11 years building toward this moment. The plan had started forming the day they'd kicked me out. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and I'd made one mistake: falling in love with someone they disapproved of. Not because of anything real, but because of their own prejudices and narrow-minded views. When I'd refused to end the relationship, they'd given me an ultimatum: choose the family or choose him. I'd chosen love, and they'd chosen to pretend I no longer existed. What they didn't know was that the person I'd chosen had connections. Real connections. His family had money, influence, and most importantly, they'd welcomed me with open arms. They'd paid for my college education, helped me change my identity, and supported me as I built a business empire that now rivaled anything my birth family could have imagined. I moved through the party, making small talk with relatives who had no idea they were speaking to the ghost they'd created. My aunt complimented my suit and asked what I did for work. I told her I was in acquisitions, which was technically true. I acquired things that other people thought were safe. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was standing in a house that would soon belong to me. The foreclosure papers were already filed, though they wouldn't know for another week. My brother-in-law's construction company had been hemorrhaging money for months, thanks to some carefully orchestrated contract disputes and permit delays. My sister approached me, drawn by curiosity about the well-dressed stranger at her party. She asked if we'd met before, saying I looked familiar. I told her I had one of those faces, and she laughed, agreeing that she felt like she knew me from somewhere. The conversation was surreal. She was talking to her own brother, the one she'd helped convince our parents to disown, and she had absolutely no idea. She mentioned how nice it was to have such a small, close family, how they'd always been there for each other through everything. I nodded and asked about her brother, the one I'd heard had left years ago. Her expression darkened immediately. She said he'd made his choice and that some people just couldn't handle being part of a real family. She added that they were better off without him anyway. The rage that had fueled me for 11 years burned hotter, but I kept my expression neutral. I told her that sometimes people who leave have their reasons, and that family isn't always what it seems from the outside. She dismissed this with a wave of her hand, saying that blood was blood, and that real families stuck together no matter what. The hypocrisy was staggering, but I'd expected nothing less. My mother joined our conversation, and I found myself face to face with the woman who'd given birth to me and then acted like I'd never existed. She was polite but distant, clearly trying to figure out who I was and why I was at her daughter's party. She asked how I knew the family, and I told her it was a long story, one that went back many years. She pressed for details, but I deflected, saying that some stories were better left in the past until the right time came to tell them. The evening progressed, and I watched my family interact with each other, noting the dynamics that hadn't changed. My brother-in-law still dominated conversations, my mother still played favorites, and my sister still basked in being the golden child. They'd created their perfect little bubble, and they'd convinced themselves that removing me had made it even more perfect. But bubbles have a tendency to burst. As the party wound down, my brother-in-law pulled me aside. He'd been drinking, and his earlier politeness had given way to suspicion. He asked me directly who I was and what I wanted, saying he didn't like mysteries and that I was making his wife uncomfortable. I looked him straight in the eye and told him that mysteries had a way of solving themselves, usually when people least expected it. I added that discomfort was often the first sign that someone was about to learn something important about themselves. He didn't like that answer, but before he could respond, my sister appeared at his side. She'd been watching our conversation and looked concerned. She asked if everything was okay, and her husband told her he thought I should probably leave. I agreed that it was time for me to go, but I told them both that this wouldn't be the last time they saw me. In fact, I said, they'd be seeing a lot more of me very soon. As I walked toward the door, I turned back one final time. The entire family was watching me now, sensing that something was off, but unable to put their finger on what. I thanked them for their hospitality and told them it had been enlightening to see how they treated family. My mother asked what I meant by that, and I simply said that they'd understand soon enough. Some lessons, I explained, took time to learn, but they were always worth the wait. I left them standing there, confused and unsettled, with no idea that their world was about to collapse around them. Update 1. The foreclosure notice arrived at their house 3 days later. I know because I'd arranged for a friend to drive by and confirm it had been posted. My brother-in-law's construction company officially filed for bankruptcy the same day, and the local newspaper ran a small story about it in their business section. But that was just the beginning. The real revelation came when my sister called the number on the foreclosure notice to try to negotiate a payment plan. The voice that answered belonged to the law firm I'd hired, and when she asked to speak to whoever was in charge of the case, they transferred her to me. I let the phone ring twice before answering with my legal name, the one I'd changed to 11 years ago. She didn't recognize it, of course, but when I told her I was the new owner of her family's debt, the confusion in her voice was palpable. She asked how this was possible, how someone she'd never heard of could suddenly own their house. I explained that debt had a way of changing hands, especially when someone was motivated to acquire it. I told her that I'd been very motivated indeed. The conversation that followed was exactly what I'd imagined for 11 years. She begged, she pleaded, she offered payment plans and promised to find the money somehow. When none of that worked, she tried anger, demanding to know what kind of person would destroy a family's life like this. I told her that I'd learned from the best, from people who'd shown me exactly what it felt like to have your life destroyed by the people who were supposed to love you most. I said that some lessons were best taught through experience. She still didn't understand, not completely, but I could hear the first seeds of recognition in her voice. She asked if we'd met before, if she'd somehow wronged me in the past. I told her that we'd met more than once, actually. In fact, we'd known each other for the first 18 years of my life. I said that if she thought hard enough, she might remember a conversation we'd had about family loyalty and blood being thicker than water. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. She said my old name, the one I'd been born with, as if testing whether it could possibly be true. I confirmed that she was correct, and I told her that I'd kept my promise from all those years ago. I'd said I'd make them regret their choice, and I'd meant every word. Update 2. The phone call started immediately after that conversation. First my sister, then my mother, then relatives I hadn't heard from in over a decade. They all wanted to talk, to explain, to somehow undo 11 years of silence with a few desperate conversations. My mother was the most persistent. She called every day for a week, leaving voicemails that progressed from confusion to anger to bargaining to what sounded like genuine remorse. She said she'd made a mistake, that they'd all made a mistake, and that family should forgive family. I finally answered one of her calls, and the conversation was everything I'd expected and nothing like I'd prepared for. She cried, which I hadn't anticipated. She said she'd thought about me every day, wondered where I was, hoped I was okay. She claimed they'd tried to find me, but that I'd disappeared completely. I told her that disappearing had been the point. When your own family makes it clear that you don't exist to them, becoming invisible is a survival skill. I explained that I'd built a new life with people who actually understood what family meant. She asked if I could ever forgive them, if there was any way to fix what had been broken. The vulnerability in her voice almost cracked my resolve. But then I remembered the 18-year-old kid who'd stood in this same house, begging these same people to accept him for who he was. I told her that forgiveness was something that had to be earned, not demanded. I said that they'd had 11 years to reach out, to try to make things right, but they'd chosen their comfort over their conscience. Now they were facing the consequences of that choice. My brother-in-law tried a different approach. He showed up at my office building, somehow having tracked down where I worked. Security called to ask if I wanted to see him, and I told them to send him up. He looked terrible, unshaven, Desperate, clearly not sleeping. He sat across from my desk and tried to negotiate, offering me everything he could think of. He said he'd make a public apology, that they'd welcome me back into the family, that they'd do whatever it took to make this right. I listened to his entire pitch without saying a word. When he finished, I told him that his offer was 11 years too late and about $1 million too short. I explained that I didn't want their apologies or their acceptance anymore. I'd found both of those things elsewhere, with people who'd given them freely instead of grudgingly. He asked what I did want, and I told him the truth. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to lose everything because of someone else's choices. I wanted them to experience the helplessness, the abandonment, the realization that the people they'd counted on most had decided they weren't worth fighting for. He left my office looking defeated, and I felt empty. Not satisfied, not vindicated, just empty. Update 3. The house sold at auction 3 weeks later. I didn't bid on it. I'd never wanted the house itself, just the power to take it away. A young family bought it, probably getting the deal of a lifetime without knowing the history behind it. My sister and her family moved in with my mother temporarily, which created exactly the kind of tension and resentment I'd hoped for. My mother called to tell me about the arrangement, clearly hoping I'd take pity on them and somehow reverse what I'd set in motion. Instead, I told her about my life over the past 11 years. I described the family that had taken me in, the education they'd provided, the business I'd built. I explained how I'd gotten married 2 years ago to someone who loved me unconditionally, and how we were expecting our first child. I told her about the life I'd built without them, the success I'd achieved, the happiness I'd found. I wanted her to understand exactly what they'd thrown away when they'd chosen their prejudices over their son. The conversation ended with her asking if she'd ever meet her grandchild. I told her that my child would grow up knowing what real family looked like, people who chose love over fear, acceptance over judgment, loyalty over convenience. But as the weeks passed, the satisfaction I'd expected to feel never came. Instead, I found myself thinking about the 18-year-old who'd started this journey and whether this was really what he would have wanted. The revenge was complete, but it felt hollow. I'd proven my point, demonstrated my power, shown them the consequences of their choices. But I'd also become someone I wasn't sure I recognized, someone who could systematically destroy the people who'd raised him, even if they'd failed him in the end. My husband noticed the change in me. He asked if I was happy with how things had turned out, and I realized I didn't know how to answer that question. I'd spent so many years focused on this moment that I'd never really considered what would come after. 3 months later, I got a call from my sister. She'd found a job and was slowly getting back on her feet. She didn't ask for anything, no money, no help, no forgiveness. She just wanted to tell me that she understood now what they'd put me through, and that she was sorry. She said that losing everything had taught her what really mattered, and that she wished she'd learned that lesson 11 years ago instead of now. She told me she was proud of what I'd accomplished, and that she hoped someday I might be willing to let them try to earn their way back into my life. I hung up without responding, but her words stayed with me. For the first time in 11 years, I started to wonder if there might be a different ending to this story, one that didn't require anyone to keep paying for old mistakes forever. The revenge was complete, but maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be the end.